Hello and welcome to International Trade and Finance. My name is David Hebert. I am a professor of economics at Troy University in the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. And I'll be walking you through the International Trade and Finance class that I'm teaching this semester. So we're going to begin with lesson one, which is just going to be an overview of international trade. So I'm going to presume that you have taken principles of micro or even intermediate micro at some point, and that you've done well. If this does not apply to you, then I would recommend checking out a principles of micro textbook and going over that before starting this lesson, just so that you have some sort of a foundation. But if you've taken those classes and you've done well, then let's begin. So we're going to begin just by recognizing a very simple thing, that global trade exists, that the world produces about $74 trillion worth of stuff every single year, and that about a third of this is bought and sold internationally. Okay, so, but this 1/3 is probably a bit of an underestimate. But even if it's not, that's still almost $25 trillion worth of goods and services that are sold and bought across borders. Okay, so this is what we're talking about here represents about a third of the world's GDP, which means that getting this international trade and finance policy right is tremendously important for the overall welfare of everyone. If you get these policies right, you'll have more international trade and people will live healthier and wealthier lives. If you get this wrong, people suffer. Like, this is a very real class. This isn't some, esoteric topic. This is a very real class that if you get it right and you understand the policy implications of these things, people's lives can be saved. So this is a very important topic. Okay. Now in this video or in this series, we're going to be approaching this from a very US based perspective. Okay. Now this is not to say that the US is somehow special. This is not saying that the ideas here are American or anything like that. It just so happens to be the case that I am based in the United States, and because of that, the US experience is the one that I'm the most familiar with. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on here. Everything that we're going to talk about in this class applies equally to, all other classes as well, or all other countries as well. So there's no, particular reason other than the fact that I already know enough about the US to go through this. There's no reason to focus on the US other than the fact that I already know it. Okay, so there's no special theory for Nepal, there's no special theory for China, there's no special theory for the UK, right? All the things apply equally well in all countries at all times. Okay, so from our perspective, who does the US trade with? Okay, so if we just list the top 5 countries that the US trades with, those would be Canada is number 1. So thank you, Canada. China is number 2. Mexico is number 3. Japan is number 4. And then Germany rounds out the top 5. Okay, so these are the top 5 countries that the United States trades with. And let's just look at the dollar figures of trade that we trade with them. So these are all in billions. Okay, so Canada is over 600 billion. China is 550 approximately. Mexico is almost $500 billion. Then we get to Japan, and it drops off to 225, and Germany falls further down to $150 billion per year. Okay, so one thing we might be interested in understanding is why there's sort of this cutoff, right, between the top three and all other countries. Why does it drop? Like here, it only drops by $100 billion, which sounds ridiculous to say only, but here from three to four, it gets cut by over 50%. I mean, it gets cut by more than in half. So that's weird. Like what happens here? How do we explain just this big drop? Okay. So let's think if we can think of an intuitive reason. Okay, so a lot of this class is going to be based on intuition. All right, trying to develop an intuitive approach to understanding these things. So let's see if we can explain two of these countries. Okay, so can we explain why the US trades so much with Canada and Mexico? Right? Well, one thing that's unique about these two countries is that we border the Canada and Mexico, right? And we have, NAFTA and everything else going on with them. So we have trade deals with them in place. Okay. And then so that makes sense why Canada and Mexico would be on this list. But what about China? Right? Why is China number two? Well, it turns out China's a big country. And I don't just mean geographically, I mean economically. Right? It's something like 1/7 of the world population lives in China. They produce a ton of goods and services for the rest of the world. And so it makes sense that we would trade with China because they have produced so much stuff. Okay? So it makes a little bit of sense to think about this in terms of both the proximity, so that explains Canada and Mexico, and the size of the economy, which explains China. Right? Japan is very, very far away, and their economy is significantly smaller than China. Their GDP per capita is probably on par or even higher than China's, but their total GDP is very low relative to these other countries. Right? Same can be said for Germany. Okay, and so what we might want to do is model. Okay, so I'm going to switch to a new piece of paper. So maybe we want to model that says that distance and size of economy or economies matter. All right, so maybe we want a model that says that, because that could explain a lot of the top five here. Okay, so we need a model that says that countries that are close together will trade more than countries that are further apart. And we need a model, and we also need that model to say that countries that are bigger will trade more with each other than countries that are smaller. Okay, so let's just start to think about what that model might look like. So let's call this T, and we'll say Tij, and that's going to stand for the volume of trade, between countries I and J. I'll finish that J. There we go. Okay. And let's suppose that we want to have a model, right, that says that as the size of the economies increases, the volume of trade increases. Okay, so maybe we want to do something like yi times yj. That's an I, but it should be a J. There we go. All right, and these are just the GDPs. So Y sub n is the GDP of country n, right? In this case, n is equal to I and j. So we have, as the volume or the economies grow, we have greater trade. So that is consistent with our findings in the top five for the US. But now we need something that will decrease the volume of trade if the distance increases. So what if we did something like divided by the distance between countries I and j? Dij is equal to the distance between countries I j. Okay, and so this model, right, if this simple fraction of three variables, right, has all the characteristics that we want. It says that as distance increases, volume of trade will decrease, right, because we have a number in the bottom of a fraction here, and if that goes up, the total fraction decreases. And it also says that as the GDPs, or the sizes of the economies, increases, the volume of trade will increase. And so now, right, we need to basically come up with a way to fit this better to data. And so the way economists do that, and the way mathematicians and statisticians do it, is we just start adding in constants that we can manipulate. So maybe we'll add in an A here, and we'll put an A here, and a B there. And how about, let's see, how about a C right here, right? So A, lowercase a, lowercase b, and lowercase c are all constants, right, that help us fit the data better. Okay, and so this could be a great model, and in fact it is. It's called the gravity model. Right, so no, unfortunately, I did not just come up with this out of nowhere. This is an actual model in international trade, and it actually has a pretty high degree of explanatory power, which is pretty fantastic. So let's think about some implications of this, right? I'm filming this in Montgomery, Alabama, and so if I wanted to go buy groceries, right, I would probably go to a big grocery store instead of a small one, right, which says that I'm going to trade more with large grocery stores than small ones. And I'm going to go to the one that's closest to my house rather than the one that might be in, let's say, Las Vegas. Okay, so the volume of trade between me and a grocery store in Las Vegas, right, is going to be very, very small because I don't go there. It might even be zero, right? Well, I guess I do go to Vegas once every other year. So it might be very vanishingly small, maybe $3 every 2 years. Okay, but the volume of trade between the grocery store in my neighborhood and me is very, very high, right? Because the distance is very small. Their GDP, or the amount of groceries that they have in the store, is relatively large, and so I trade with them. Okay, so there's at least a little bit of predictive power, or at least some explanatory power, in this model. It's far from perfect, but it's really not that bad. And in fact, even setting lowercase a, lowercase b, and lowercase c equal to 1 does generate a pretty accurate view of the world. Right? It's fairly intuitive. Okay, so it's not perfect, okay, but it's also not terrible. Okay, so at the very least, it's a very useful starting point for doing our analysis. And one of the forms of analysis that we economists do lies in identifying anomalies. I have to look up how to spell this. Anomalies. There we go. Okay. So what distinguishes an economist from basically every other field of science is our ability to recognize anomalies. Okay, so let's say we had a study that came out that said that the two countries did not trade as much as the theory predicted. Right? Or let's do something outside of international trade for a second. Let's think about the Card and Krueger minimum wage study. Okay, so Card and Krueger have a famous paper, David Card and Alan Krueger, on minimum wage. Okay, so if you've taken Principles of micro, you know the standard theory says that if you raise the minimum wage above the market clearing price, you will generate unemployment, or more accurately, you will generate disemployment effects. Okay, so it might not manifest itself as unemployment, but it could be the case that you generate disemployment effects. Okay, and so David Card and Alan Krueger took advantage of the fact that uh, there was a new minimum wage law put in place in New Jersey, but no change in the minimum wage in Pennsylvania. And these two states, border each other. So it gave them an excellent opportunity to do a natural experiment. And their findings were that the minimum wage did not cause any type of increased unemployment. Okay. And so that's a curious thing because it flies in the face of theory, right? The theory says that there should be an effect, and their study said that there wasn't one. Okay, so this led to an investigation by other economists. And so, what were some of the disemployment effects that happened, right? Well, in New Jersey, what we saw was less or no overtime compared to Pennsylvania, and we saw fewer shifts per worker per week, meaning that every worker worked fewer hours, right? And so because of two, more people were actually hired, but each person worked fewer shifts. And so the result is that the unemployment rate in New Jersey decreased, which is true, which is what they found, but nobody was actually, or none of the current workers were really given an effective raise on their income or their total salary because they just got fewer hours. Okay, so once you controlled for these two things going on, the story of the minimum wage and causing disemployment effects and everything suddenly proved to hold. Okay, so economists are very good at identifying anomalies, and the gravity model is another way that we can do this. Okay, so we can use the gravity model to explain anomalies. Okay, and what we do is we can apply this model to say like the U.S. and the Netherlands. Let's say Netherlands, Belgium, and Ireland. Okay, and so what we would find is that the theory predicts a relatively low amount of trade for these three countries and the US, and yet the world shows that trade is much higher than what the gravity model would predict. Okay, so now we've identified an anomaly. These three countries are an anomaly within the context of the gravity model. They would be, outside of the bounds of, standard error or anything like that. Okay, and so we need to find a way to explain this. Okay, so in the case of Ireland, right, it turns out that Ireland speaks English, and that tens of millions of people in America are descendants of Irish immigrants. So we share a lot of culture with Ireland, which helps us trade with them. We're more similar to them than it turns out most people expect. With respect to, oh, and then there's also the case that in Ireland, due to some fancy accounting tricks and everything, known as double Irish accounting, which maybe we'll get into later on this semester, there's a lot of companies have their corporate headquarters in Ireland. Most famously Apple, who was just chewed out by the European Union for not paying enough taxes to Ireland, which was interesting because Ireland said that that Apple had paid enough taxes, and Apple said that they had paid enough taxes, but the European Union was demanding that Apple pay more taxes to Ireland for some reason. It's unclear to me why, but okay. So Apple is there, Facebook has a corporate headquarters there, Google, Microsoft, several other companies all have a corporate headquarters in Ireland. Okay. With respect to Belgium and the Netherlands, well, they're actually on the mouth of the Rhine River, which makes them excellent shipping locations. Okay, so it's just very easy for us to ship things to Belgium and the Netherlands. And so the volume of trade is much higher for those two countries than it would be if they did not have that river. Okay, so in the next video, we'll explore this model some more, and we'll use it to identify more anomalies and do some more work.